Roland Tarnwood came to his senses at the sound of shattering porcelain. A stranger's memory flooded his mind at the same moment he felt a sharp pain in the back of his head. He was standing in the middle of the cold hall of the Glenmore ancestral estate. Before him, three men in gray cloaks, members of the Copper Bill of Exchange Guild, were taking paintings off the walls and packing them into boxes. The eldest of them, named Gossel Merk, held a sealed scroll in his hands and was reading aloud the inventory of the estate. The servants huddled against the walls. A young girl clung to the frame of the last portrait and refused to let go. His memory told him that this was Lyra, his younger sister. His memory also revealed the most important thing. He was dead. He had been a transportation engineer. For 30 years, he had built roads and bridges in his own world. Then the formwork collapsed at a construction site, and his world came to an end. And now he was trapped in the body of a 20-year-old idler who had squandered what remained of his father's fortune on wine and cards. Merk finished reading and announced that the Tarnwood household owed 42,000 gold crowns. The guild was granting a deferment until the end of the season, 90 days. After that, the Glenmore lands and mines would pass to the creditors, and the family would be sent to debtor's prison. Merk spoke in the monotonous voice of a man who had uttered these words hundreds of times. He didn't even look at Roland. Everyone knew that the young Tarnwood was good for nothing but begging and drinking. Roland slowly unclenched his fists. The engineer inside him was already at work. He asked to see the inventory. Merk was surprised, but handed over the scroll. Roland scanned the columns of numbers and found what he was looking for. Interest had been recalculated 3 times within a single period. He calmly stated that the guild had violated its own charter regarding compound interest, and that upon recalculation, the debt amounted to 36,000, not 42. He also said that if the guild took the paintings today, it would be considered a partial repayment at the appraised value, and he would demand an official document bearing the treasury's seal. The room fell silent. Merk reread the scroll. His clerk turned pale and whispered in his ear. The error was genuine. For the first time, Merk looked Rolana in the face. He saw before him the same slacker with cloudy eyes. But the eyes were no longer cloudy. Merk ordered the paintings to be returned to the walls. He said the debt would be recalculated and that the Tarnwood household had 90 days, not a day more. He bowed just as much as etiquette required and left. Lyra looked at her brother as if she were seeing him for the first time. The old steward, Hob, grumbled that the master had bought himself a week's reprieve, but that everything would still come crashing down. Roland didn't argue. He demanded the ledgers and the maps of the estate. Hob brought the dusty volumes with the air of a man carrying out a dying man's last will. Roland pored over the maps until nightfall. A strange picture was emerging. Glenmore was rich. High-quality iron ore lay in the northern tunnels. In the eastern foothills, spark crystals were mined, which mages bought up for lamps and heating. In the valley stood a golem workshop where the old master, Varus, employed 50 clay workers. Each golem could lift a load 10 times heavier than a human could carry and required no food. And despite all this wealth, the household was destitute. The reason lay on the map right before his eyes, the Sarngor Range. The wall of mountains cut Glenmore off from the capital's markets. The only pack trail across the pass allowed a caravan of mules to pass once a week. The journey to the nearest trading town took 12 days. The ore lost 2/3 of its value by the time it reached the buyer. The crystals shattered along the way. Merchants didn't want to deal with that godforsaken place. Roland's father, Baron Oswald, had spent 20 years paying his neighbors for the right-of-way and had gone bankrupt on customs duties. Now the old baron lay upstairs, knocked out by a blow, and wouldn't get out of bed. Roland looked at the map and felt a long-forgotten sense of excitement welling up inside him. He didn't see mountains. He saw a route. The elevation change across the northern pass did not exceed 400 sajans over a 30-verst stretch. The gradient was manageable. In his former world, loaded trains had traveled along such gradients. There were no steam engines here. Instead, there were spark crystals that gave off heat and power. And there were golems that could pull and push tirelessly. The rails could be rolled from their own ore. He took a blank sheet of paper and began to calculate. The numbers fell into place neatly. The cost per verst of track, the weight of the rail, the axle load, the capacity. By dawn, the plans for this world's first railroad lay on the table. 30 versts of steel track from the Glenmore mines through the northern pass to the trading city of Marvain. In the morning, he gathered everyone who remained at the estate: Hob, Lyra, Master Varus, and 12 servants. He said that in 90 days the estate would either be paid off in full or cease to exist, and that it would be paid off with the help of an iron road along which wagons would travel without horses. Hob looked at him as if he were mad. Varus chewed his lips in silence. Lyra asked what they were all supposed to do. Roland replied that for starters, they needed to sell his wine collection. Every last bottle. The servants gasped. The Roland of old would have sold his sister before he'd ever sold the wine cellar. That evening, a dealer arrived at the estate and took away 400 bottles for 900 crowns. With that money, Roland ordered the first prototype rails from the village blacksmith and hired 20 laborers from the starving village of Nizhny Kluchi. The men would take on any job because, after the crop failure, their children were eating tree bark. Hob grumbled that the master was burying his last money in the ground. Roland silently drove the first survey stake into the vacant lot behind Varus's workshop. He knew the value of skeptics. For 30 years, he had been building where people said it couldn't be done. At night, he stood over the map and gazed at the Sarngor Range. The mountains had stood in his way for 900 years. He gave them 90 days. The morning began with a revolt. 20 diggers from Lower Keys stood by the marked-off vacant lot and refused to dig. Their foreman, named Garth, crumpled his cap and said the men were afraid. A rumor had spread through the villages that the young baron had gone mad and wanted to pave the way for demons. Iron in the ground attracts lightning. That's what a wandering preacher said. Roland didn't argue about demons. He asked Hart how much his children had eaten the day before. Hart fell silent. Roland said he'd pay a silver groschen a day and a hot soup at noon, and that the first one to spot a demon would get an extra groschen. The men exchanged glances and picked up their shovels. Hunger proved stronger than the preacher. The work began. Roland laid out the track according to all the rules of his past life. He marked the gradients, dug drainage ditches, and laid a ballast bed of crushed stone. The village blacksmith brought the first rails, and Roland rejected half of them. The metal was bubbly and cracked in the cold. He had to go to Varus. The golem workshop greeted him with the scent of clay and ozone. Varus listened in silence. Roland explained that he needed a furnace with constant heat to roll iron, and that spark crystals could provide this heat if gathered into a bundle and encased in copper. Varus pursed his lips and then said that the young gentleman had just described the heart of a battle golem. That was how they heated the clay for the guards' machines under the old king. Varus had been an apprentice back then. He went into the storeroom and brought out a bronze cylinder in which a ruby-red light smoldered. A crystal crucible, the last one left. A week later, a rolling mill was set up behind the workshop. The blacksmith wept when he saw the red-hot strip emerge as straight as a string. The rails turned out to be usable. Roland counted every crown. The money from the wine was dwindling. He pawned his mother's earrings and the silverware. Hob handed him pawn tickets, bearing the undertaker's face, and muttered that in a month there would be nothing left to pawn. Roland replied that in a month he would have a verst of track laid.
He was wrong. In a month, he had 1.5 versts. The diggers got into the swing of things and worked even harder. Men from 2 neighboring villages joined them. Rumors of easy money spread faster than rumors of demons. The day of the first test arrived. Varys reconfigured 4 cargo golems. Roland placed them in pairs on a wheeled frame and connected the drawbars to the axles. The golem didn't pull the cart like a horse. The golem turned the wheel directly via a crank.
3 platforms loaded with ore, weighing a total of 600 poods, were attached to the rear. The whole district had gathered to watch. Merchant Dalton from Marvine had also come. He'd stopped by to buy up crystals on the cheap. Dalton stood in the crowd and loudly told his neighbors that the young baron's iron wagon was about to tear itself in half, and that he had personally seen 20 such schemes, all of which had ended in bankruptcy. Roland gave the signal. Varys inserted clay tablets containing the command into the golems' heads. The drawbars creaked, the wheels turned. The train shifted and began to roll. At first, it rolled slowly, then faster. Then it raced along the embankment so fast that the boys couldn't keep up. 600 poods of ore flew along the steel track at the speed of a fine riding horse. And the golems neither breathed nor grew tired. The crowd was silent. Then it roared. Hart tossed his cap in the air. Lyra was laughing and crying at the same time. Roland wasn't looking at the train. He was looking at Dalton. The merchant stood with his mouth open. Then he closed his mouth. Then Roland saw the abacus clicks in the merchant's eyes. Dalton pushed his way over to him and spoke in a different voice. He asked how much it would cost to transport 100 poods to Marvane once the road reached the city. Roland named a price 3 times lower than the standard freight rate. Dalton took off his glove and held out his hand. He said he wanted the first contract and was ready to put down a deposit today. Dalton's deposit amounted to 2,000 crowns. That money was enough to rent the rails all the way to the saddle. That evening, for the first time in a year, the scent of roasted meat filled the estate. Hob walked along the set table, repeating over and over that he had seen with his own eyes how iron carried stone. He said this like a man who needed to hear his own voice to believe it. And that night, a guest arrived at the estate. Viscount Kestrel owned the lands on the other side of the northern saddle. For 20 years, he had collected tolls from the only pack trail, and those tolls had sustained his household. Kestrel sat in an armchair by the fireplace without removing his gloves. He congratulated Roland on his amusing toy. Then he placed an old charter on the table. The royal seal confirmed that the pass lands of the northern saddle belonged to the Kestrel family. The Viscount smiled and said that a railroad would never pass through his saddle. Unless, of course, the young baron ceded him half a share in this toy. He left without waiting for a reply. Roland remained by the fireplace, the charter in his hands. 30 versts of the route ran up against 3 versts belonging to others. He stared into the fire and mentally redrew the map of the mountain range. That day's victory had died before the night was even over. Roland stayed awake until dawn, and by morning his decision lay on the table. It was audacious. Kestrel's charter granted the Viscount the saddle and the trail. But the charter mentioned only the surface of the passlands. There was not a word about the subsoil. Under ancient mountain law, the subsoil of the entire Sarngor range belonged to the crown, and the crown sold mining concessions to anyone who paid. Roland would not go over the pass. Roland would go under it. Hob heard the word tunnel and sat down next to a chair. He said that the gentleman had planned to dig through a mountain a verst thick, and that it would take 10 years and the entire treasury of the kingdom. Roland laid out the blueprints. He chose a spot where the ridge narrowed and where the verst shrank to 300 sajans. He didn't count with pickaxes. He counted with a crucible. Varys confirmed that a cluster of spark crystals fired at full power produced heat intense enough to cause granite to crack and crumble. And golems fear neither the stifling heat, nor cave-ins, nor working 3 shifts without light. Lyra went to the capital's chancellery with the family's last funds and returned with a mining concession in the name of the House of Tarnwood. The paper cost 800 crowns and bypassed Kestrel entirely. The Viscount found out and galloped over on horseback. He shouted at the gate that it was a scam and that he would complain to the king. Roland brought him a mug of cider and politely replied that complaining to the king about a royal concession was a bold plan. Kestrel rode off, black with rage. The tunneling began. After that, time blurred into a single humming mass. The furnace scorched the face, and the mountain creaked. The golems shoveled out the cuttings and reinforced the vaults with oak. People worked outside on the access ramps. 2 weeks later, the tunnel had penetrated 40 sajans into the ridge, and Roland slept soundly for the first time in a month. 3 weeks later, disaster struck. During the night, the strata above the tunnel face burst, and the arches crumbled. 2 golems were crushed to shards beneath the rubble. There were no people down there, and that saved the entire operation. Varys sifted through the clay debris, and the old man's hands were shaking. Roland sat in the tunnel for 2 days. He found the mistake. He had been driving the tunnel in a straight line, but he should have gone higher up along the dry seam. The earthly habit of trusting the soil had played a cruel trick in a mountain saturated with magic. Crystal veins were altering the rock and crumbling it from within. Roland rerouted the tunnel higher up and ordered every archon of the vault to be tapped. The tunneling proceeded more slowly but stopped claiming lives. Meanwhile, outside, something unprecedented was unfolding. Word of the road had spread throughout the western region. People from distant, starving villages were flocking to Nizhny Kluchi. Roland took everyone in. Diggers piled earth on both sides of the tunnel. Women wove baskets for the rubble. Teenagers hauled water. The village, which had survived the winter by eating tree bark, built 20 new log cabins and hired a teacher for the children. Hart supervised the 300 workers and learned to read blueprints. Dalton brought 3 more merchants from Marvain. They stood at the tunnel entrance, listening to the mountain rumble, and signed contracts for future shipments, right on a barrel that had once held nails. The down payments went into the company's coffers. Hobbs started a second ledger because the first one had run out of pages. The old man no longer grumbled. He now lied to every visitor, claiming that he had believed in the gentleman from the very beginning. On the 40th day, what Roland had been waiting for and fearing happened. Gossel Merk arrived. The creditor walked along the embankment, looked at the tunnel and the rolling mill. His face betrayed no emotion. Then he explained why he had come. The Copper Bill of Exchange Guild had received an offer to buy out the Tarnwood family's debt. No sum party was offering to pay the full 45,000 for a debt of 36,000. Whoever buys the debt will have the right to demand payment in full on the due date. And that someone very much wants Roland to be without money on the due date. Merk paused and added that the guild was still considering the matter. The guild does not like being used in other people's wars, but the guild loves profit. He advised the young baron to act quickly. Roland asked for the buyer's name. Merk replied that the secrecy of the deal was sacred. But as he was leaving, he paused at the gate and remarked aloud that the feathers on Viscount Kestrel's hat were particularly lush this season. Roland returned to the tunnel. 100 fathoms of granite remained to the crosscut at the face. 50 days remained until the deadline. He gathered Varys Garth and Lyra and told them that from now on, tunneling would proceed around the clock in 3 shifts, and that he himself would take the night shift. The mountain hummed incessantly. On the 51st day since work began, a draft swept through. The face golem struck and the granite caved in. Daylight poured into the hole. They had broken through the tunnel. People on both sides of the ridge were shouting and embracing one another. Lyra stood in the breach, exposed to the wind, with the light from the other side of the mountains falling on her face. Roland rode through the tunnel and emerged onto the eastern slope. 12 versts below lay Marvain with its markets, warehouses, and river. Between the road and the city lay a valley as flat as a table. And across that valley, a cavalcade of horsemen under Kestrel's banner was riding toward him, kicking up dust. There were about 15 horsemen. Kestrel rode at the front in his road armor, his expression suggesting he had already won. He stopped his horse 5 paces from Roland and declared that the eastern exit of the tunnel overlooked his meadows and that no railroad tracks would be laid across his land. Roland silently unfolded the map. He pointed out that from the portal, the route veered south and ran across the Crown Wasteland along the old riverbed. Kestrel's lands remained a full verst away. Roland had verified this even before the first pickaxe blow. The Viscount stared at the map for a long time. He had nothing to say by law, so he spoke outside the law. Leaning forward from his saddle, he remarked that iron had many enemies. Rails could be bent, embankments could be washed away, golems could be destroyed, and no piece of paper would save a nighttime road in a remote valley. He turned his horse around, and the detachment rode off, kicking up dust toward his castle. Roland watched them go and realized that the Viscount would no longer resort to legal action. The Viscount would resort to sabotage. He proved right 9 days later. During those 9 days, the track layers had advanced 7 versts through the valley. They worked non-stop. Platforms delivered the rails right to the front line of the track laying. And the track grew by 1 verst a day. No one in the world had ever seen such speed. Marvain was already visible from the embankment. And on the 10th night, near the bridge over the old riverbed, Garth's sentry spotted lights. In the morning, they found sawed-through bridge piles and an abandoned saw. 2 nights later, someone had loosened the fasteners on a completed section, and the switch had shifted off course. A loaded flat car derailed and plowed through the embankment. Miraculously, no one was killed. Roland called a council meeting. There were no guards at the Tarnwood estate. There was neither the money nor the time to hire mercenaries. And then Garth stood up. He said that the road provided for 11 villages, and that if the Lord gave the people the right, the people themselves would protect their livelihood. Roland granted them that right. By evening, patrols of villagemen armed with pikes and signal horns were stationed along the road. Varys fashioned 4 sentry golems that never slept and could sense the warmth of a living body in the dark. 3 nights later, the patrol at the bridge sounded the alarm. They caught 3 men with crowbars and flammable oil. One turned out to be a gamekeeper for Kestrel, and by morning all 3 had told the clerk, for the record, who had paid them and for what. Roland did not take the report to the judge. The district judge dined at Kestrel's on Sundays. Roland did things differently. He sent copies of the report by special messenger to 3 addresses: the Royal Chancery, the Copper Bill of Exchange Guild, and the Marvain Merchants' Assembly. His calculation was cold and calculated. The Crown would receive a complaint about the violation of a royal concession. The guild would learn that its future debtor Kestrel was spending money on robbery, and the merchants of Marvain learned exactly who was blocking the road that promised them rivers of gold. The merchants acted faster than anyone else. Marvain thrived on trade, and the Viscount, with his tolls, had long been a thorn in the city's side. The assembly revoked Kestrel's warehousing privileges and barred him from the city's grain market. The guild announced that consideration of the Tarnwood family's debt redemption had been suspended in light of new circumstances. And from the Viscount's chancery came a summons to the royal court regarding the case of damage to crown property. Kestrel went into hiding behind the castle walls. On the 48th day, there was just over a month left until the deadline, and Marvain was 4 versts away. And then the road came to a halt. They ran out of iron. The rolling mill had used up the ore supply, and there was no way to transport new ore because all the flat cars were busy with track laying. Roland spent a whole day crunching the numbers this way and that. It came down to either the road or the deadline. Lyra provided the solution. She placed the Marvin City newspaper in front of her brother. The front page was full of praise for the marvelous road. She said that if everyone wanted to travel on the road so badly, they should pay for it before it was even finished. Roland looked at his sister and laughed for the first time in a month. 2 days later, in the hall of the Marvain Merchants Guild, he announced a subscription drive. The House of Tarnwoods was selling freight warrants, a certificate for 100 poods of cargo at a fixed price with priority shipping rights. Dalton was the first to buy 3,000. A line formed behind him. By evening, the subscription had brought in 11,000 crowns in cash. Hob counted the chest 3 times and said he'd never seen so much money all at once in his entire life. The ore went into the furnace. The road crept toward the city once more. On the 63rd day of construction, the last rail was laid on the embankment at Marvin's freight yard. The first full train traveled from the Glenmore mines to the city in 4 hours. A pack caravan used to take 12 days to travel this route. Half of Marvin turned out to greet it at the freight yard, and on the 75th day, Gosselmerk stood once again in the hall of the Glenmore estate. Roland laid 36,000 crowns on the table, in gold and bills of exchange from the Merchants Guild, 15 days ahead of schedule. Merk counted it all himself. Then he put away his abacus and remained silent for a long time. Then he said that in 30 years of service, this was the first time he'd seen a dead man not only come back to life, but outpace the living. He signed the receipt for full payment and turned around at the door. He said that the guild knew not only how to collect, but also how to invest, and that if Baron Tarnwood needed money for a second railway, the guild would offer the best rate in the kingdom. The door closed. Lyra was squealing and clinging to her brother's neck. Haba wept openly over the receipt. And a week later, a royal messenger in a travel uniform stopped him on the road near Marvin. He handed Roland a package with gold embossing. His Majesty King Edwin III wished to see Baron Tarnwood and his railroad in person, and that very evening, Dalton brought bad news from the capital. In the capital, the railroad was the talk of every palace. And speaking the loudest of all was Duke Malvern, who controlled all river transport in the kingdom. He argued that the railroad was a dagger in the back of the crown and that it must be brought under strong control before it was too late. Roland traveled to the capital via his own railroad as far as Marvain, and then continued by river steamboat. He spent those 5 days on the water wisely. He observed the layout of Duke Malvern's docks. All the warehouses, all the barges, and all the laborers on the great Own River bore his colors. The river monopoly had sustained the Duke for 100 years, and Roland now understood the scale of the enemy. His 30-verst journey was no trivial matter for Malvern. It was the first crack in the dam. The capital greeted Roland with rumors. In the taverns, people argued about the railroad. Street leaflets portrayed him as a hero, a charlatan, or a demon worshipper.
An audience was scheduled for the 3rd day. The throne room was full. King Edwin III turned out to be a gaunt, weary man of about 60 with watchful eyes. Standing to the right of the throne was the Duke of Malvern.
Roland recognized him immediately from Dalton's description. A stocky man with the face of a kind uncle and the eyes of a moneylender. The king ordered him to speak. Roland spoke. He spoke without flattery or fawning. The numbers spoke for themselves. The cost of transporting a pood of ore had fallen by 2/3. Marvain had collected more duties in a single month than in the previous 6 months combined. 11 villages had forgotten about famine. Malvern took the floor. The Duke spoke softly and almost affectionately. He praised the young baron's diligence, and then he turned that praise on its head.
He said that the roads by which an army could march right through the kingdom were not a matter of trade, but of war. That such power could not be left in the private hands of an impoverished family, and that the House of Lords had prepared a petition to transfer all the Crown's railroads to the administration of a special chamber.
He himself was ready to head the chamber out of pure loyalty to the throne. The hall buzzed with approval. Roland looked at the king and saw that the king was wavering. Then Roland asked permission to ask the Duke 3 questions. The king nodded. Roland asked how much it cost to transport a pood of grain down the Ona River from Marvain to the capital. Malvern smirked and named the price. Roland asked how many days it took for a barge to travel in the autumn waters. And Malvern answered that as well. Then Roland took a sheet of paper from the folder and asked for it to be read aloud. The secretary read it out. It was a cost estimate for the road from Marvain to the capital through the lands of 3 counties loyal to the crown. The overland transport was 4 times cheaper than river transport, and the journey took 1 day instead of 2 weeks. And at the bottom of the estimate was a proposal. The House of Tarnwood grants the crown a quarter of the revenue from all future roads and the right of priority for military transport. In return, the crown grants concessions and protection. Roland raised his head and said in the ensuing silence that the Duke was right about one thing. Such power should not belong to a single person. That is precisely why it cannot be entrusted to the Duke either. Let it belong to the crown and serve everyone, while those who have already proven their ability will be the ones to build and manage it. The king was silent for a long time. Then he asked the Duke why the river toll had doubled in 10 years, yet the treasury had not grown richer as a result. Malvern began to explain about the shallows and the bandits, but the king had already raised his hand. The decision rang out across the hall. The crown hereby establishes the Royal Road Concession. Baron Roland Tarnwood is appointed as builder and administrator with the right to a quarter of the revenue for the crown. The first section of Marvain, the capital, must be laid out before winter. The hall erupted. Malvern bowed to the king with his usual expression of a kind uncle, and for just a moment his gaze met Roland's. There was no malice in that gaze. It was a verdict. That evening, a man in plain clothes came to Roland's inn and delivered an invitation to dinner from the Duke. Roland went because one doesn't turn down such invitations. Malvern received him alone in a study filled with maps and ship models. He poured some wine and spoke plainly. He said he was impressed and that the young baron reminded him of himself 40 years ago. Then he made an offer. 100,000 crowns and the Duke's daughter's hand in marriage in exchange for a controlling stake in the concession. Roland thanked him and declined. Malvern wasn't surprised. He twirled the wine glass between his fingers and, as a parting remark, said something strange. He said that iron beats water in numbers, but loses in one respect. Water doesn't need rails that stretch for hundreds of versts across open fields, and that no one can guard when turmoil breaks out. And turmoil in the kingdom is a lucrative business. Roland stepped out into the night, the cold seeping between his shoulder blades. It wasn't a threat of robbery, it was a promise of war. Back home in Glenmore, news awaited him. The good news arrived first. The Merca Guild had granted the concession a loan of 60,000 at the kingdom's best interest rate. Varys had recruited 40 apprentices, and the workshop had turned into a factory. Garth had become the head of all road construction, and his crew had grown to 1,000 men. Surveyors were already staking out the route to the capital. Then the bad news arrived. Lyra laid out letters from Dalton's informants in front of her brother. Malvern was buying up grain and mercenary spearmen through frontmen. 3 southern earls had received forgiveness of their old debts from him. Viscount Kestrel, having lost his case in the royal court, sold his castle to him and left for the south to join those same counts. And on the border of the southern provinces, attacks on royal couriers had become more frequent. Roland spread a large map of the kingdom on the table and stared at it for a long time. The engineer in him saw the routes, gradients, and bridges. But now something else was emerging on top of the roads. Supply lines, defensive strongpoints, and the speed at which regiments could be redeployed. He picked up a stylus and began to draw a second network on the map, one he hadn't shown to anyone yet. The roads he planned to build next were not just for trade. If Malvern wanted unrest, it would arrive on the rails. Lyra asked over his shoulder what he was drawing. Roland replied that he was drawing a future in which no one would ever come to describe their home again. Outside the window, a night train from Marvain rumbled past on the embankment. Freight was being shipped to Glenmore around the clock. And to the south, at that very hour, 3 counts were raising their glasses in a castle purchased by the Duke, toasting that the railroad would die along with its builder. Winter arrived in Glenmore, along with the first 1,000 workers on the new route. The line to the capital stretched 140 versts across the lands of 3 counties. And for the first time, Roland was building not a road, but a system. He divided the route into 8 sections and assigned a foreman from Garth's old work crew to each one. Varys was shipping out 2 traction golems a week and still couldn't keep up. The factory was running 3 shifts. Hobb hired 4 clerks and was still drowning in paperwork. Roland introduced what in his past life had been called a construction schedule and a standard design. Bridges were assembled from identical trusses. Stations were built according to a single blueprint. Each foreman received a sketchbook showing how to lay the rails, how to secure the ties, and how to divert water. Garth carried these sketchbooks around the work sites as if they were sacred relics. The laying rate increased to 2 versts a day, a pace unheard of even among the gnome work crews of the East. But the longer the road became, the longer its shadow grew. The first blow came from an unexpected direction. In Dalvin County, an old cemetery from the village of Viazi lay right in the middle of the route. Roland proposed a detour of half a verst and funding for a new fence. But a week before his arrival, a man dressed as an itinerant preacher had passed through the villages. He claimed that an iron serpent was disturbing the bones of the ancestors and that the earth would take revenge on the living. When the surveyors arrived to mark out the detour, they were met by a crowd armed with pitchforks. 2 of them were beaten. The survey markers were burned. Roland forbade Hart to pit the men against one another. He rode to Viazi himself, accompanied only by Lyra and without an escort. They listened to him sullenly. He didn't argue about the serpent. He asked the village elder how many young men had left the village over the past 5 years, because there was neither work nor bread at home. The elder counted 11. Roland said that the station near Viazi would provide work for 20 people, and that the village would be able to transport its flax to the capital in a day rather than a month. Then he did something no one expected. He offered to let the village choose the site for the station itself and decide where the road should bypass the cemetery. And he placed a deposit on the table for the first flax harvest in advance. The crowd dispersed in silence, but the pitchforks were already leaning against the fences. And 3 days later, a boy from Vyazov brought Garda, that very preacher. The men subdued him themselves when they saw him burying a clay tablet under the embankment, one inscribed with a witch's curse against the golem. Under his cassock, they found a purse full of new southern crowns and a travel permit signed by the steward of one of the southern counts. Roland sent the man, the tablet, and the travel permit to the royal investigator in the capital. The second blow was more cunning. In the middle of winter, shipments of copper, without which Varys could not crimp the crystal bonds, came to a halt. Copper in the kingdom came from 2 mines, and both had been contracted for the month by the capital's trading house, Irwin and Sons. Dalton pored over the papers and discovered that the Irwin firm had been living on credit from the Malvern River Treasury for the past 3 years. The Duke wasn't hiring mercenaries just for show. The Duke was quietly buying up everything needed to build the road. Roland convened a council, and Varys unexpectedly announced that the copper could be replaced. Even before the Copper Age, master craftsmen had been crimping crystals with silver steel from the east. It was 3 times as expensive, but it retained heat better. Dwarven caravans transported the eastern steel through the port of Lindholm until Malvern managed to reach the dwarves. Roland sent Dalton to Lindholm with a letter of authorization and promissory notes. The merchant returned 3 weeks later with a contract and a guest. The guest was chest-high to a man and as wide as a doorway. His name was Master Brock of the Karn Doom Miners Guild. The dwarves had heard rumors about the tunnel under Sarngor and didn't believe that humans had dug through granite in a month and a half. Brock came to take a look. He tapped the tunnel's arches with a hammer, walked the entire length of the tunnel back and forth on foot, and then remained silent for a long time.
Then he said that the arches were built correctly, but that humans lacked the most important skill. Humans don't know how to listen to the mountain, and that the Brotherhood was ready to send 20 mining masters to work on future tunnels in exchange for one. The dwarves wanted a branch line leading to their eastern adits. Roland shook the stone hand, and from that day on, the road ceased to be the concern of a single house. By spring, the line to the capital had reached the Olna River.
Here, the third blow awaited, and it was the most brazen. The bridge across the Olna was the only place where the road crossed the Duke's waterway. Malvern did not set anything on fire. He filed a petition with the royal court, arguing that the bridge piers would narrow the navigable channel and ruin shipping, and with it, the crown's tolls. By law, the court was obligated to halt construction pending a decision. The decision could be dragged out for years, and the Duke had hired the capital's finest lawyers. Construction ground to a halt at the water's edge. 1,000 workers sat idle on the bank. Every day of inactivity cost 300 crowns. In the capital, Malvern's newspapers reported that the Iron Baron would be ruined by summer. Roland read the Duke's petition all night long, and in the morning he was laughing so hard that Lyra came running. The petition concerned the piers in the riverbed. Roland ordered the draftsman to dig up his old calculations, which he had made back when he was working on the tunnel. A week later, counter-documents were filed with the court. The road authority rejected the bridge design with piers. The road authority proposed a new design. A single-span arch spanning the entire Olna River without a single pier in the water, a 120-sajan steel span set on crystal-forged dwarf pillars. No one had ever built a bridge like this before. The Duke's lawyers ridiculed the proposal, and the court demanded proof that such an arch was feasible. Roland requested 3 months for construction and offered a wager. If the arch collapsed, the entire fleet of the concession would be forfeited to the river treasury. Malvern personally came to court upon hearing of the wager and insisted that the court accept the terms. He was certain he was burying the road with its own hands. The judge struck the gavel. 3 months. Roland walked out of the courtroom and looked out at the wide, gray waters of the Olna. The engineer within him was already assembling the arch in the air, joint by joint. He had built such spans in a past life. But back then, he had steel from factories and cranes. Here, he had gnomes, golems, and 3 months. Behind him, Lyra quietly asked if they would make it in time. Roland replied that he had no right to give any other answer. Work on the arch began from both banks at once. Roland designed it as a cantilevered structure. The two halves of the span grew toward each other over the water, held in place by guy wires anchored to the riverbank piers, and were meant to meet at a lock in the middle of the river. A mistake in the lock, even as small as the palm of a hand, would mean the ruin of the entire structure. Brock and the gnomes forged the truss joints in portable forges right on the riverbank. The crystal forging produced steel that rang like a bell and bent without cracking. Varus assigned 8 tall golems, rebuilt specifically for working in the wind, to the assembly. People were not allowed to go up there. Roland had forbidden it. He remembered how he had perished in his previous life and had no intention of paying for his haste with the lives of others. Malvern kept watch. Every day, a pleasure barge carrying the Duke's observers sailed past the construction site on the Olne. The capital's newspapers printed drawings of the unfinished cantilevers and ran headlines about the Iron Madman. In the taverns, bets were being taken, with 10 crowns against the arch for everyone in favor. Dalton grimly reported that the Duke was secretly buying up these bets by the thousands, and that if the arch collapsed, he would profit twice over. Toward the end of the first month, what Roland feared more than any sabotage actually happened. The river flooded. Heavy rains fell in the mountains to the east, and the Olna swelled overnight. The water rose by 1.5 fathoms, carried driftwood downstream, and pounded the riverbank abutments with logs. The tension cable on the left cantilever sang like a string. The design had accounted for floodwaters, but not for logs. Roland didn't leave the shore for 3 days. Hart and his crew built a wattle and daub wall in front of the pier to deflect the floating debris. Varys's golem stood chest deep in the icy water, taking the logs head-on. Two golems were swept away into the river for good. The pier held. When the water receded, Brock inspected the guy ropes and said that one had stretched by a finger's width. The gnomes retied the knots in 2 days. The schedule had fallen behind by a week, so Roland reorganized it, cutting a week off the finishing work. And halfway through the second month, a guest arrived at the camp from whom Roland least expected any help. Malvern's daughter had arrived. Lady Severina Malvern showed up unannounced with a single maid and asked to be shown the construction site. Roland expected a spy or a decoy and led her along the shore, choosing for himself what to show her. An hour later, he realized he'd been wrong twice. Severina asked questions that sent a chill down his spine. She asked why the consoles were growing asymmetrically, and he explained about wind loads. She asked how he would adjust the lock when the temperatures of the two halves differed, and Roland stopped mid-sentence. The Duke's daughter was mentally calculating the temperature differentials across the steel span. She looked at his face and smiled for the first time. She said she'd been living among her father's shipbuilders for 12 years, and that her father had allowed her to draw hull plans until he realized his daughter could draw better than his engineers. Now her father was looking for a husband for her who owned land by the river. As she was leaving, she said something strange. She said that her father didn't believe in the arch because he had spent his whole life buying people, and an arch couldn't be bought, and that she would come to see the closing ceremony. Roland watched her carriage drive away for a long time. Lyra, who had been present throughout the entire inspection, told her brother not to even think about it. Roland replied that he was thinking only of the Arch Castle. That was almost true. The joining ceremony was scheduled for the 91st day. Roland had gained a day's leeway and hadn't told anyone about it except Garth. He wanted to perform the joining at dawn when it was coldest, so that the two halves would contract and the castle knot would slide in easily. Half the capital had gathered at the shore. The royal secretary arrived with the Fircourt clerk. Malvern arrived with the legal officials and the prepared deed of transfer for the rolling stock. Severina arrived and stood not beside her father, but at Roland's drafting table. At dawn, two tall golems carried the locking mechanism to the center of the span. Below, the river was silent, as were the 3,000 people on the banks. The mechanism hovered over the joint. Brock, from below, shouted the clearances into his megaphone. 1/2 inch. 1/4. The joint settled into its socket with a rumble that rolled across the water like the toll of a giant bell. The gnomes above drove in the wedges and waved a flag. The arch stood. 120 fathoms of steel hung over the ulna without touching the water. What was happening on the banks defies description. People were hugging strangers. Hart was down on his knees. Hobb had lost his hat and hadn't even noticed. And Roland was looking at the Duke. Malvern tore up the prepared decree himself without waiting for the trial and threw the scraps into the river. Then he summoned his secretary, gave a brief order, and left without saying a word to anyone. Severina lingered at the drafting table. She placed her hand on the drawing of the arch and said that her father had lost for the first time today, and that a loser is more dangerous than a winner. She said a word that Roland remembered. She said that her father would now stop interfering with the road and start interfering with the kingdom. 2 weeks later, the first train passed through the arch on its way to the capital. King Edwin was riding in the lead car himself, and halfway across the span, ordered the train to stop so he could look down at the water. The capital welcomed the road with the ringing of bells. The concessions freight offices were taking orders a month in advance. Merck brought congratulations from the guild and a new line of credit. And that night, after the celebrations, Dalton was found in a back alley in the capital with a knife under his ribs. The merchant survived by a miracle because the knife had slipped off the bill of exchange book tucked under his arm. When he came to, he whispered to Roland that he'd managed to catch a glimpse of a tattoo from the Southern Mercenary Brotherhood on the attacker, and that the day before, he'd discovered where the Duke was sending the grain he'd bought up. The grain was being transported to the fortresses of the 3 southern counts. That's not how you supply people who aren't starving. That's how you supply an army. Roland took the report on the grain and the mercenaries to the king himself. Edwin received him in a small study without his entourage, listened without interrupting, and seemed to age before Roland's eyes. Then the king said something Roland hadn't expected. The king said he knew. The Secret Service had been reporting on the southern mobilizations for 3 months. But the crown had no evidence of treason, only grain, the purchase of which was not prohibited, and mercenaries whom the counts allegedly kept to fight bandits. To strike first would mean being branded a tyrant, and half the peers would side with the South. The crown could only wait for the blow. And then Roland unfolded on the royal table the very map he had been sketching at night in Glenmore. The second network. He spoke for an hour. He demonstrated that if a blow was inevitable, it must be met not with walls, but with speed. The road from the capital south to the garrison town of Farley, via the junction at Marvane, would give the crown the opportunity to deploy 5 regiments in 2 days to a place where it would take the Southerners 3 weeks to reach. It is not the one with the most spears who wins the war. It is the one who takes up position first. In Roland's former world, every general staff knew this. In this world, no one had realized this. The king stared at the map for a very long time. Then he asked how much time and money it would take. Roland replied that the southern route was 200 versts long and involved one large tunnel through the Farley Heights Ridge. With the dwarves, the Varus factory, and the crown's decree on the right-of-way, he could lay the tracks in 8 months. He did not ask the crown for money. He asked for something else. The right to recruit and arm the railway guard himself. The king signed the agreement that very evening and added, on his own initiative, something Roland had not even mentioned. By secret decree, the crown would pay for half of the southern line from the military treasury. The construction project of the century began under the guise of a commercial branch line. From then on, the months flew by like the scenery outside the window. Garth divided the route into sections, and his railroad crews advanced southward on 4 fronts. Brock, along with the Miners' Guild, dug into the Farley Heights from both sides. Varus handed over the factory in Glenmore to the traction golems and set up a second factory near Marvane for the sentry golems. The railway guard was recruited from veterans who had completed their service and from men in the roadside villages. By fall, the force numbered 800 men stationed at signal towers along the entire network. Hobb was put in charge of the concessions treasury and 4 offices. The old man grumbled that they had turned him into a minister, but you could tell by the look in his eyes that he felt like one. Malvern, meanwhile, had vanished from the capital. Officially, the Duke had departed for his ancestral estates too. Informants reported that he was touring the southern counties. Severina remained in the capital, and Roland began receiving letters from her. The letters contained not a word about politics. The letters contained questions about bridge designs and load calculations, and Roland found himself replying at night after 14 hours of work, realizing that these replies were the only things he wrote with pleasure. Lyra read over his shoulder and remained silent, a silence that spoke volumes. In mid-fall, Severina came to the southern tunnel, construction site herself. She brought not questions, but a warning. Her father had offered her hand in marriage to the young Count Darrell, the most ruthless of the southern trio. She had refused for the first time in her life, openly defying her father. Her father told her that after winter, no one would care about her consent. She repeated these words to Roland, looking him straight in the eye. After winter, the strike is scheduled for spring. That very night, Roland sent a messenger to the king and proposed to her himself. Not marriage, a job. He offered Lady Severine Malvern the position of chief bridge engineer for the Royal Road concession. She laughed until she cried. Then she agreed. Then she said that didn't rule out marriage, and that the Baron had better think faster than he builds. The scandal in the capital rang louder than the tolling of church bells. The River Duke's daughter had gone to work for the railroad. Malvern publicly disowned his daughter, and that was his mistake. The disownment gave Severine free rein to speak her mind. She knew her father's river business like no one else, And now the throughput of his docks and the cargoes of his barges were on the table for the concession. It all seemed to indicate that the Duke was shifting his fleet from transporting grain to transporting people. Construction didn't grind to a halt in the winter. Roland employed what was known in the past world as winter laying. The trackbed had been prepared since fall. The rails were laid in the freezing cold on joints, warmed by crystal braziers. The gnomes in the tunnel didn't even notice winter. A week before the spring sowing, the tunnel breakthrough beneath the Farley Heights went off with pinpoint accuracy, and Brock said that now people knew how to listen to the mountain.
The entire southern line was completed in 7 months and 3 weeks.
At the opening ceremony in Farley, Garrison General Odo looked at the regiment that had arrived from the capital 6 hours earlier and said that in 30 years of service, he had never seen anything more terrifying than this peaceful road. He was the first to understand its true name. And 9 days after the opening, in the pre-dawn hours, a horn sounded from the signal tower by the bridge over the Olna. Barges without lights were coming up the river from the south. Many barges. The road guard in the tower counted 60 and lost count. The barges were not carrying grain. Assault ladders lay on the decks beneath the sails, and spearmen of the Southern Brotherhood sat in the holds. Duke Malvern's fleet was heading for the capital, and the rebellion of the Three Counts had begun not in the spring, as promised, but a month earlier. Roland was in Marvain when the signal chain delivered the news an hour later. He stood over the map and saw what he had seen his whole life: a race against time. The capital's garrison would hold out on the walls for 3 days. The Crown's regiments were stationed in Farley, 200 versts to the south. His route lay between them. He raised his head and ordered the entire line to be cleared. All trains were to carry troops. War had come by water. The response would travel by rail. Roland drew up the first military schedule in the history of this world in 40 minutes at a table in the Marvain freight office. The task was monstrous: to transfer 5 regiments with their supply trains from Farley to the capital. That was 11,000 men and 600 metric tons of cargo. The track had a single track and 8 passing loops. A mistake in the schedule meant a head-on traffic jam and a dead-end line. Roland scheduled the movement down to the minute. Trains headed north in waves of 4 at half-hour intervals, while empty cars were shunted into the passing loops according to a strict sequence. Severina sat down at the telegraph. There was no telegraph system as such, but there was a signal chain operated by the track guards, and it turned the signal towers into a communication line, relaying train numbers via a code of signal fires. Gart personally took up position at the main junction where the waves converged. Varys dispatched all the repair golems to the line. The first train carrying infantry left Farley 2 hours after the order was given. General Odo loaded the regiments with skepticism. The old soldier said that if the trains failed, the capital would fall and he'd be hanged next to the Baron. Roland replied that a shared gallows was practically an alliance. Odo grunted and climbed into the lead car himself. The trains ran all night. Roland didn't leave the map in Marvain, where signals were pouring in. The schedule went haywire twice. At the bridge over the Olna, the platform's axle caught fire from overheating, and Garth, along with repair golems, pulled the platform off the tracks in 11 minutes. During the third wave, a machine golem came to a halt in the middle of the track with a cracked order board, and a replacement locomotive left Viazi station 7 minutes later. The village that had greeted the road with pitchforks a year ago now lit the way for the trains all night long with bonfires along the tracks. By the end of the first day, the capital had received 2 regiments. By the end of the second, all 5. 11,000 soldiers marched 200 versts in the time it took the Southern infantry to cover 30. When Malvern's barges approached the capital's docks at dawn on the third day, they were not met by militiamen on the ramparts. They were met by the Crown's line regiments deployed along the shore with garrison artillery at direct fire range. The assault died before it began. The mercenaries of the Southern Brotherhood fought for money, not for miracles. And when they saw troops on the shore that, by all the laws of war, should not have been there, a third of the barges simply turned and headed downstream. The rest landed further south and retreated to join the Count's army, which was advancing along the shore. The war was not over. The war had only just revealed its true face. What followed was a month that Roland would never forget until his second death. The army of the Counts and the Duke numbered 20,000 and knew how to fight the old-fashioned way. It marched on the capital, burning the crown's villages, and its strength lay in its sheer mass. The crown had 15,000 men in the road. Roland was now stationed not in his office, but at Odo's headquarters, and his map had become the master map of the war. He was carrying out what in his world was called a maneuver along the interior lines. Regiments were loaded onto trains and appeared where they were not expected. The Southerners laid siege to the junction at Marvain, and within a day were flanked by 6,000 bayonets transferred from near the capital. They withdrew. They moved to outflank the enemy via Dolven, and at Vyazov they ran into infantry that had dug in overnight, troops that had arrived while they were still on the march. Each time, the Count's army arrived at the battlefield exhausted after a week-long march, while the road saved the crown both the soldiers' legs and precious days. Odo, who a month earlier had not believed in the power of iron, now demanded a railway branch line to each of his camps. Malvern understood everything faster than his counts, and he struck not at the army, but at the road. In a single night, small bridges along the line were blown up in 6 places by combustible charges set by the Duke's river sappers. Saboteurs were moving through the country disguised as refugees. The road patrols caught some, but others kept coming. The road began to break up, and Hart and his crews patched up each breach around the clock under guard. Roland responded in a way that every railroad worker in his world would recognize. He created repair trains. These trains carried ready-made trusses for small bridges, a supply of rails and ties, and a repair crew with golems on their flat cars. 2 such trains were stationed, ready to go, in Marvain and in the capital. Breaches that had previously taken a full day to repair were now being closed in 4 hours. And Severina made a move that dismantled the Duke's entire sabotage network. She knew her father's river sappers by name from her days at the shipyards. Using her lists, the railway guard apprehended 9 people on the roads, including the Duke's chief miner, who revealed the locations of the explosive depots during interrogation. The war hurtled toward a climax at the end of the month, when the Counts decided to do what they should have done from the start. The entire Southern Army, as a single mass, marched not on the capital but on the Farley Tunnel. They finally realized that the heart of the road was the narrow pass beneath the heights. Take the tunnel and the network would fall apart. 20,000 Southerners set up camp at the passageway leading from the southern portal. The tunnel was defended by a garrison of 1,500, and everyone understood that it would not withstand an assault. Odo was gathering regiments for a countermarch, but by any calculation, it was clear that the Crown's army would be half a day too late. A silence hung over headquarters, the kind from which surrenders are born. And then Roland asked for a topographic map and posed a single question to Brock, who had brought the dwarven sappers to headquarters. He asked whether it was possible to bring down the eastern slope of the gorge in front of the southern portal without damaging the tunnel itself. Brock thought for a long time, moving his lips as he calculated. Then he said that the Brotherhood had been bringing down slopes for 200 years, and that this slope was practically begging to be brought down. But would the Baron then be able to stand before the king after having buried the passageway he himself had built? Roland replied that the tunnel could be dug out in a month. The kingdom, however, could not be dug out. On the night before the assault, the dwarves' mining charges were placed in the crevices of the eastern slope. At dawn, as the southern columns entered the gorge to take up their starting positions, the mountain sighed and collapsed. The landslide didn't kill even 1,000 men. It did worse. It cut off the vanguard of the Count's army, trapped in the gorge, from the main forces and blocked the only supply route for the 20,000-strong army. And by noon, Odo's convoys approached the field from the north along the cleared route, and the Crown's regiments began unloading directly into battle formation. The Southern Army stood in the crumbling pocket for 2 days without water or supplies, watching as fresh infantry deployed against them. On the third day, Count Darrell sent out envoys. The other two counts surrendered shortly afterward without waiting for battle. The rebellion ended without a decisive battle. It was strangled by logistics. But when the commander's tent was searched in the captured camp, Malvern was not there. The Duke had vanished a day before the collapse, abandoning the Count's army just as one abandons a lost bet. His river fleet had also disappeared from the Olna. A week later, news arrived from Dalton's port informants. The Duke's fleet had anchored at the mouth of the Olna, in the coastal fortress of Stormhold. Taking control of the kingdom's only seaport, Malvern had lost the war on land and cut off the country's access to the sea. The capital celebrated the victory, while Roland sat poring over a map of the estuary, unable to find a solution. Stormhold had been built 300 years ago to defend against sea raiders, and it had been built to last. The fortress stood on a rocky island at the throat of the estuary. The walls withstood any bombardment from the shore. The fortress's cannons covered the entire fairway, and not a single barge could pass out to sea without the Duke's permission. There was no land route to the island. The Crown had no fleet either. Malvern's fleet was the kingdom's entire fleet. The Duke declared this openly in a letter he sent to the king via a brazen messenger. He wrote that he was not a rebel, but a loyal servant of the crown, forced to defend himself against an iron-fisted upstart. He offered peace. The crown would pardon him for everything, grant him Stormhold with the perpetual right to collect maritime duties, and revoke the road concession. Otherwise, the kingdom would not sell a single bale of wool overseas, nor buy a single sack of salt. The calculation was cunning and precise. War had ravaged the south. The treasury was empty. Maritime trade provided the crown with a third of its revenue, and the merchant class was already exhausted. In the House of Peers, talk began that the land was the land, and the sea was the sea, and that an agreement had to be reached with the Duke. Merk arrived in Glenmore looking gloomy, and stated bluntly that the guild would grant concessions and money for anything except war with the sea. The guild cannot afford to lose the sea. Even Odo threw up his hands. The army cannot walk on water. Roland remained silent for 3 days. He rode along the front lines, watched as the portals of the Farley Tunnel were being repaired, and as the men returning from the war tilled the fields, and he remained silent. On the 4th day, he gathered all his people in Glenmore, Severina, Braca, Varys, Garth, Dalton, Hobb, and Lyra, who had arrived from the capital and was now handling all the concession affairs with the Chancellery. He didn't lay a map of the estuary on the table. He laid out a map of the entire western coast, and he asked what they saw. Everyone saw the coastline. Severina was the first to notice it. 80 versts north of the Olna estuary lay Calder Bay, deep, sheltered from storms, and completely deserted, because between the bay and the settled lands lay 80 versts of treacherous Calder marshes, through which not a single road passed. You can't block off a port if there are 2 ports. Malvern controlled the Olna's mouth. That meant the kingdom needed a new mouth. Roland said aloud what everyone had already realized. The concession would build a line across the marshes to Calder Bay and establish a new crown seaport there. Hobb clutched his heart and his abacus at the same time. He said that swamps weren't mountains. In the mountains, at least, there was something to hold on to. Brock unexpectedly nodded at the old man's words and added that the Brotherhood wouldn't venture into the quagmire and that the stone gnomes would hold their ground. Varys remained silent, kneading clay between his fingers. And then Garth spoke up. The former village headman of the starving village said that his grandfather used to wander through the Calder marshes in search of cranberries and that the marsh was not uniform. Within it, there were ridges, solid sandy ridges hidden beneath the moss. They didn't run straight, but they were there. Old people used to drive their livestock across them. Roland looked at Garth and remembered his first master from his past life, who used to say that surveying doesn't begin with a theodolite, but with a conversation with the elders. The survey teams set out for the marshes a week later. Roland applied everything he remembered about marsh construction. Where the ridges broke, he laid down boardwalks and a layer of peat mixed with sand. Severina designed lightweight trestles on oak piles for the movable windows. Varus fashioned a new type of golem with broad feet like a duck's, which didn't sink into the quagmire and hauled the piles where a horse would have sunk up to its head. The work was grueling. The midges devoured people whole. 3 piles were driven into the ground at each location. By the end of the first month, they had covered 11 versts, and Hob wept over the expense ledgers, no longer even trying to hide it. Malvern found out and laughed. His pamphlets in the capital depicted the Baron drowning in a swamp, embracing a railroad track. The Duke was certain that the swamps would accomplish what the courts, saboteurs, and the army had failed to do. He even returned a portion of the maritime trade to the crown by opening a shipping lane for select merchants to show that it was possible to coexist with him. The House of Lords calmed down. People in the capital joked about Calder. And then the Duke stopped laughing, because by the 3rd month, the line had cut through half the marshes, and Roland began transporting more than just pilings into the bay. Convoys carrying stone for the breakwaters and timber for the piers began moving along the completed section. Construction of the port began before the road was finished. Roland built them toward each other just as he had once built an arch. And then Malvern did what Roland had been waiting for and preparing for. Since it was impossible to reach the cove by land, the Duke set out by sea. At dawn on the 108th day of the marsh construction, 8 warships flying the flag of the river house approached Calder Cove. They carried boarding parties and barrels of flammable liquid. Their orders were simple: burn the piers, sink the stones in the fairway, and leave. There would be no port if there was nowhere to moor. The galleys entered the bay in the morning fog, and in that very fog, crystal horns sounded from the unfinished pier. For 3 weeks, Varus and Brock had been secretly installing on the piers what the gnomes called mountain spears, bundles of battle crystals that fired a jet of white heat 200 fathoms far. The very same heat that cut through Sarngor's granite. 2 galleys burst into flames from bow to stern in a minute. The remaining 6 rowed out of the bay without engaging in battle, for wood cannot wage war against light that cuts through stone. And on the pier, next to the smithy spears, stood a railguard of 800 bayonets, which Roland had transported into the bay by train in a single night, upon a signal from the coastal watchtowers. That morning, Malvern lost more than just 2 galleys. He lost what mattered most. He lost the sea as a monopoly on power. The news that the railroad had burned the warships reached the capital within a day via the signal chain, and the Council of Peers fell silent. And a month later, the first maritime merchant from across the strait, a foreigner with slanted eyes and a cargo of salt, sailed his ship into Calder Bay, lured by the promise of tripled port bonuses, and moored at the new pier. The salt was transported to the capital via the marsh route in 9 hours. The kingdom breathed the sea once more. That evening, Roland stood on the pier with Severina, watching the lights of the first ship. She said that her father was now trapped in Stormhold with his fleet, as if in an expensive cage, and that, having been backed into a corner, he would stake everything on one last gamble. She knew what she was talking about. 3 days later, the Duke's dispatch ships vanished from Stormhold, all at once. Meanwhile, Dalton's informant in the harbor tavern across the strait overheard a conversation about how the River Duke was inviting the overseas ruler to visit. Malvern was offering the Eastern Empire of Kargat the one thing it lacked: an ice-free port and pilots who knew Olna. The Duke had squandered his kingdom on his own people and was now selling it to outsiders. Roland himself brought the news of the collusion with Kargat to the king, along with Dalton and his informant. Edwin listened, and his face turned ashen. Kargat was not one of the 3 rebellious counts. The empire across the strait ruled over 20 nations and had been searching for 40 years for a western port for its fleets. The Council of Peers convened that very evening, and for the first time since the war began, not a single voice in the chamber was in favor of negotiating with the Duke. Betrayal of one's own is forgiven more often in this world than trade with strangers. The crown declared Malvern an outlaw and Stormhold a rebellious fortress. But declaring it was easy, taking it was impossible. The fortress, situated on a rocky island with a fleet at its walls and 2 years' worth of supplies, defied any siege from the shore. And if the Kargat squadrons entered the estuary before the fortress fell, the Empire would have to wrest Stormhold from them. Odo stated plainly in the council that the crown had a month, perhaps 2, before Kargat could assemble an invasion fleet, and that during that time the impossible must be achieved. Roland asked to speak and spoke briefly. He said that the fortress's strength lay in 3 things: its walls, its fleet, and the certainty that the island could not be approached from land. The walls and the fleet need not be touched. We must shatter that confidence. He asked the crown for a month, all the reserves from the Varus factory, all the stone being hauled by the trains, and silence. He revealed the plan only to King Odo and his own people. When Severina saw the blueprints, she was silent for a long time, and then said that her father had built his life on the water and that it would be fitting if the land itself came for him. The plan was just crazy enough that no one would expect it. From the shore to the cliffs of Stormhold lay 800 fathoms of a shallow strait with a strong current. Roland conceived of an earthen dam with a railroad track running along its crest. Not a siege camp, not a bridge. A full-fledged railroad line out into the sea, all the way to the very walls of the fortress, along which trains carrying stone, siege engines, and infantry would travel. In his former world, that was how straits were blocked and piers were built. In this world, no one had ever seen anything like it, and therein lay the full power of the plan. Work began covertly, accompanied by a diversionary smokescreen. Odo ostentatiously set up a siege camp on the southern bank of the estuary, and the Duke drew attention there. Meanwhile, 40 versts to the north, on the empty shore facing the cliff, the concessionaire launched the main construction project. The marshy road to Calder served its purpose twice over. It wasn't just merchants who traveled along it to the new port. Stone was also transported along it to the strait. Hart assigned 1,000 railroad workers and every dump truck available to the embankment. Trains would approach the water's edge, and Varus's broad-footed swamp golems would push the stone into the sea along the marked line. The embankment grew 20 fathoms a day from the shore. They laid the track directly on the fresh fill, and the next train delivered stone along the crest of yesterday's embankment. The road built itself and stretched out into the sea. Malvern saw the embankment from the towers on the 6th day, when it had grown 100 fathoms from the shore. At first, they laughed at the fortress. Then the Duke calculated the rate of construction and stopped laughing. He did the only thing he could. He sent a fleet to tear down the embankment. Galleys approached and fired catapults at the work trains, while boarding boats landed crews on the crest. And then the second half of the plan was revealed. Along the dam, at intervals of 50 sajans, sockets had been embedded in the embankment beforehand, and on the night before the attack, mountain spears were placed in the sockets, manned by the road guard. The dam was not an embankment. The dam was a fortress wall advancing upon the fortress. A white heat met the galleys as they approached, and after losing 3 ships, the Duke's fleet withdrew to the walls and did not venture near the dam again. He tried at night and lost boats. He tried with fire ships downstream, and Severina had calculated the position of the boom barriers anchored to catch the burning vessels 100 fathoms from the embankment. The land advanced across the water, and there was nothing to stop it. On the 29th day, the dam had advanced to within 300 fathoms of the cliff, and the siege furnaces came into play. Brock assembled on rail platforms 3 furnace spears of unprecedented power, each containing 40 combat crystals. They pounded the lower masonry of the walls from their vantage point around the clock and shifts, and the ancient granite of Stormhold, which for 300 years had withstood cannonballs, melted like wax under the white-hot blast. By the end of the month, 3 scorched breaches gaped in the lower tier of the seawall, and the dam stood 100 fathoms from the island, with convoys carrying Odo's assault infantry. The fortress garrison watched this from the walls and drew their own conclusions. The Duke's mercenaries were just as good at math as the guild scribes. On the night of the 33rd day, a mutiny broke out in the fortress. The galley crews refused to burn themselves to death for a lost cause. They seized the Duke's officers and sent a skiff with a white flag to the dam. Stormhold surrendered to the crown without a siege, having bargained for the mercenaries' lives and safe passage. In the morning, Odo's regiments marched into the fortress along the dam, as if it were a city street. The flag of the river house was lowered. But when the Duke's chambers were thrown open, they were empty once again. Malvern had set sail 2 days before the mutiny on the fastest courier ship, taking with him the treasury, Olna's pilot's logs, and 24 loyal men. He headed east. The Duke's captured secretary revealed during interrogation where he was going and why. And even Odo grew cold at his words. The Duke hadn't merely fled to Kargat's protection. The Duke was carrying the Empire's greatest treasure, the one he'd managed to steal. The complete blueprints for the railroad. The design of the tracks, the traction golems, the crystal horns, and the military schedules, everything his men had spent years sketching and purchasing. Malvern no longer wanted to own the railroad. Malvern wanted the railway of a foreign empire to come here for him. The council convened in the captured Stormhold, right in the Duke's hall, beneath his own maps. Odo's report was blunt. Kargat would field a fleet of 200 pennants in the fall and land up to 50,000 soldiers. Following the rebellion, the crown's own forces numbered 18,000, plus the road guard. There was no fleet because the Duke's galleys were suited for river combat, not for naval battles against the Empire. If Kargat landed anywhere along the coast and established a foothold, the kingdom would lose the war in terms of numbers. The lords stared at the table. Then Roland stepped up to the maps and said that Odo was right about everything except one word: anywhere. The Empire cannot land just anywhere. An army of 50,000 needs a port with deep water docks and roads leading inland. Otherwise, it will starve to death on the beaches. There are 3 such places along the entire coast: the mouth of the Olna River with Stormhold, Calder Bay, and the old fishing cove of Grimsby in the north. Everything else is just rocks, shoals, and surf. Next fall's war is already boiling down to these 3 points. And a 3-point war isn't won by whoever has more soldiers. It's won by whoever manages to deploy forces to the attacked point first. Roland unfolded his sheet of paper over the Duke's maps. On the sheet, a line encircled the kingdom's coastline, the coastal corridor. The road from Stormhold through Calder to Grimsby, 260 versts long, linking all 3 choke points into a single system, with branches leading to signal towers and fortified stations equipped with sockets for mountain spears at vulnerable sections. During the maneuver, 18,000 crown soldiers can be deployed everywhere simultaneously, because it takes less than a day to travel from any point to any other. The Empire will land 50,000 in a single location. The crown will meet them with its entire army. Odo stared at the sheet of paper for a long time. Then he told the council that for 30 years he had taught officers to calculate troop strength in bayonets, and that the Baron had taught him to calculate it in hours, and that with the redeployment he would undertake to hold the coast. The king signed the redeployment order as his first decree, and in a second decree he did something Roland had not asked for. The royal road concession was declared a matter of national defense with wartime powers. From then on, Roland could seize land for the road through any territory, mobilize factories, and set prices for suppliers. The peers swallowed it in silence because, after Stormhold, no one dared to argue with the iron. The construction of the road became the largest project in the world. Roland devoted everything to it. Garth's work crews had grown to 4,000 men and were marching toward each other from Stormhold and Calder. Brock summoned 40 more master craftsmen from Carn Duma, and the dwarves were cutting through the rocky cliffs along the coast. Varys assigned both factories to the transport and guard golems, and in the evenings he himself burned the order tablets because the apprentices couldn't keep up. Severina was building bridges across 4 coastal rivers at once, and her prefabricated farms were assembled from the ground up in 9 days each. Hobb commanded the treasury like a military commander and haggled with suppliers until he was hoarse, wielding his authority over military pricing. Lyra took charge of communications and supplies, and all the schedules for the entire network passed through her hands. Merck brought the guild's funds himself and said that the guild had finally realized which war it could not stay out of. The guild could not afford to lose the sea, and the sea was now protected by the road. By midsummer, what Roland considered his most important construction project was completed, even though there were no rails there at all. The first road-building school opened in Marvan. 40 young men from the villages along the road and 10 young women took their seats at the desks to study drafting, arithmetic, and road construction under him, Severina, and old Varus. Roland knew the value of this better than anyone else in the world. Roads aren't built by cradles. Roads are built by people who know how to build them. One day, he would be gone, but the school would remain. On enrollment day, he spotted among the students the son of that very village headman from Vyazov, who a year ago had come out to meet the surveyors with a pitchfork. The Rokadu was completed a week before the fall storms. 260 versts of track were laid in 4 months, and when the first through train traveled from Stormhold to Grimsby in 11 hours, Odo organized a military exercise. According to the scenario, the Empire was landing at Grimsby. 18 hours after the signal, 12,000 soldiers with artillery, who had arrived from all over the Rokad, were stationed by the bay. Veteran officers walked along the trains and ran their hands along the rails. And on the first day of the storms, the news they had been waiting for arrived. A patrol ship from across the strait reported that the Imperial fleet had left the harbors of Kargat, 240 pennants. On the flagship, they saw the standard of the Imperial Lord Admiral and, next to it, a man in the colors of the River House. Malvern was personally leading the foreign fleet toward his shores, but the report ended with a line that made Roland freeze over the map. The fleet was not heading for the Three Straits. The fleet was heading south toward the mouth of the Tartar River, a border river, where there was neither a port nor docks nor deep water. Only long sandy shoals and an abandoned fishing spit. Landing an army there was madness, and Roland spent the entire night searching for meaning in that madness. By morning, he had found it. Malvern knew the estuaries like the back of his hand. During the autumn flood, the Tarta's shoals became navigable for flat-bottom barges. The Empire didn't have any flat-bottom barges, but Malvern himself did. His river fleet, which everyone thought had rotted away in the backwaters of Olna, had vanished from those backwaters a month earlier. The Duke hadn't sold the Empire just the pilot books. The Duke had sold it the Fourth Channel, which no one but him knew about. The route ended at Stormhold, and from Stormhold to Tarta lay 80 versts of shoreline without a single railroad track. At the War Council in Stormhold, opinions diverged for the first time since the war began. Odo demanded that the army march to Tarta immediately. The infantry would cover 80 versts in 4 days. Roland objected that a 4-day march through the autumn mud would give the Empire time to land and entrench its first echelon, and the army would arrive at the prepared defenses exhausted and without heavy artillery, which horses cannot haul through the mud. He proposed an alternative to complete the bypass to Tarta. 80 versts in 10 days? Odo asked if the Baron had lost his mind, because even his work crews didn't lay more than 4 versts a day, and here they were talking about 8. Roland replied that until now, roads had been built to last 100 years. But this branch line had to last just 1 fall. He recalled from his past life what was called a military narrow-gauge railway and the Pace light rail, lightweight rails. Sleepers laid directly on the ground with minimal preparation. Bypasses instead of cuttings. Train speeds would be 4 times slower, but the trains would run. The king gave his consent and added that if the Baron missed the deadline, the kingdom would learn of it already under the imperial banners. Those 10 days of construction in Glenmore came to be known as the Mud Campaign. The rain fell without ceasing. 4,000 of Garth's railroad workers laid the track from both ends toward each other, from Stormhold and from the fishing spit, where people and materials had been transported by sea on barges under the protection of mountain spears. Varus's swamp golems hauled sleeper bundles where people would sink waist-deep into the mud. Severina had pontoon bridges built across 2 small rivers, each completed in a single day. Lyra kept to the schedule and her signal towers rose alongside the track.
On the sixth day, Imperial patrol galleys came to survey the shore and were driven back from the spit by the heat. On the eighth day, the last junction fell. The temporary embankment was completed 2 days before the fleet's estimated arrival, and Odo began the transfer.
Train after train crept along the winding, slippery track. Infantry, artillery, brushwood barriers, and the gnome barbed wire that Brock had devised to weave from scraps of crystal forging. Within 2 days, the entire field army of the Crown had moved to Tard. 15,000 bayonets dug into the sand dunes along the shoals, following all the rules of field fortification that Roland had sketched from his memories of the past world, and that Odo had turned into orders. The positions were built at night without any lights. By day, the dunes looked empty. The Imperial fleet approached Tarde at dawn, right on schedule. From the bridge, the shore looked exactly as Malvern had promised. A remote fishing village with no troops, because according to all estimates, the Imperial forces were stationed 80 versts away at the rock formation. A tailwind churned up the water on the shoals, and the river company's flat-bottom barges headed for the shore in the first wave, carrying 8,000 Imperial infantry. Odo let them reach the middle of the shoals. Then the dunes opened up. Field cannons unleashed a barrage of white-hot fire on the cluster of barges from 3 directions, and the shallows of the Tarda turned into a cauldron. The flat-bottomed barges burned, ran aground, and collided. The second wave of the landing mingled with the wreckage of the first. Imperial war galleys rushed in to crush the batteries and ran aground on the very same shoals that had cleared the way for the barges, while heavy cannons with stormhold range fire rained down on them from the dunes. By noon, the Imperial Lord Admiral had lost 40 ships and 8,000 soldiers in foreign shallows without landing a single standard. Kargat had fought for 40 years and knew how to do the math. To continue the landing under the scorching sun with the current running against them would have meant drowning the army down to the last barge. The fleet withdrew to deep water and drifted out of firing range. For 3 days, 200 pennants stood against the silent dunes. On the 4th day, an event occurred that decided everything, and which historians of both powers would later debate. An Imperial launch approached the spit under a white sail. Kargat requested negotiations, and Kargat named the price he was willing to pay for peace. At the negotiating tent near Tarda, the Lord Admiral, the Imperial Chancellor, who had arrived with the fleet, King Edwin Odo, and Roland, whom the king had seated next to him to the obvious bewilderment of the Imperial delegation, gathered. The Chancellor spoke in flowery language, but the essence was simple. For 40 years, the Empire had been searching the West, not for land. The Empire had been searching for a trade route. The sea route around the southern stormy capes cost its caravans half a year and a third of their cargo. The Empire went to war for the port because it saw no other way to obtain it. But the Empire saw the way. It saw the castling move. It saw the Stormhold Dam. It saw how the kingdom's army ended up where it couldn't possibly be. And the Empire knows how to change its strategy. The Chancellor laid a proposal on the table that even Edwin fell silent at. Kargat offered eternal peace and the renunciation of all claims in exchange for a treaty on through transit. A railroad from the kingdom's eastern border to the port of Calder, along which Imperial goods would travel to the Western Sea. The kingdom would build and own it. The Empire would pay a transit fee and contribute half the construction cost in gold up front. The war over the port ended at that very moment because it turned out to be cheaper to buy the port than to conquer it. And the one who led the Empire to this realization was the very person who had shown it the way in every sense of the word. Roland listened and understood that he had won the war not through the heat of battle at Tarda. He had won it on the day the first train passed through the Sarngor Tunnel, because from that day on, the entire world began to see things in a new light. The Peace and Transit Treaty was signed a month later in the capital. There remained one final clause that the Empire had set forth as a separate condition, which the Chancellor read aloud while looking at Roland. The Empire shall hand over to the kingdom the fugitive Duke of Malvern, along with everything in his possession. Cargate does not keep traitors, not even useful ones, especially not useful ones. Malvern was brought to the capital on a winter morning aboard an imperial courier ship under escort. Roland saw him at the pier and did not recognize him at first. The River Duke had wasted away and aged 10 years. Only the eyes of the moneylender remained the same. Along with him, the Empire handed over a chest containing the stolen treasury blueprints and 2 of his engineers, who had once been bought off from the concession. The trial was scheduled for a month later, and for that entire month, the capital spoke of nothing else. Roland was summoned as a witness for the prosecution, and he walked into the courtroom knowing that the verdict would depend on his testimony. Malvern maintained his usual demeanor of a kind uncle throughout the trial. He denied nothing. He explained. He said that for 100 years his house had controlled the kingdom's rivers, and those rivers had faithfully provided for the crown. That he had defended the centuries-old order against an upstart who, in just 3 years, had shattered the way of life for thousands of people. That it was not 3 counts who were rebelling, but the old world that refused to die. And that he had negotiated with the Empire over the very same terms the crown had ultimately agreed to. Transit. It was just that the crown sold the road while he sold the estuary. An uneasy silence hung over the hall because there was a truth in the trader's words, and everyone could hear it. Then the floor was given to Roland. He stepped forward and did not argue about the old world. He asked the court for permission to cite the figures, and he did. How many people died when the bridges along the line were blown up? 17 railroad workers and 3 guards. How many villages the South burned on its march toward the capital? 26. How many Imperial soldiers drowned at Tarda, where the pilot Malvern had led them? 8,000 foreign lads who had been deceived by the Fourth Throat. Roland said he was ready to respect a man defending his way of life. That way of life is defended in the council, in court, and in the marketplace. Malvern defended it with foreign mercenaries, a foreign empire, and foreign blood. Never a drop of his own. He bowed to the court and sat down. The verdict was read before a full chamber. The death sentence was commuted, at his daughter's request, to life imprisonment in the northern fortress. The River Duke's house was dissolved. The fleet and docks were transferred to the crown. Severina submitted the petition herself and personally brought her father warm clothes to the fortress. She returned a week later, silent. She told Roland only that her father, until his very last moment, had asked not about her, but about what duty was stipulated in the transit agreement, and that she was finally free. That same winter, they were married in the Glenmore Ancestral Chapel. Roland had asked for a quiet wedding and got exactly what he deserved. The chapel was packed with Garth's travelers, Brock's gnomes, Master Varys's craftsmen, Dalton's merchants, and half the village of Lower Keys, while a train carrying guests from the capital arrived in Glenmore on a first-class line, decorated with fir branches from the locomotive golem all the way to the tail platform. The king sent the newlyweds a charter elevating the barony of Tarnwood to the rank of a county. Hob wept openly and told everyone that he had nursed the count with these very hands, which was not true, but no one argued. In the spring, construction began on what would later be called the work of a generation, the Great Transit. 640 versts from the eastern border gates, through the Dwarven foothills, the capital, and Marvain, to the port of Calder. Imperial gold arrived on schedule, and for the first time, Roland was building without being driven by war or fleeing ruin. He was building just as he had dreamed, with thorough surveys and a safety margin for 100 years, complete with towns for the workers that included infirmaries and schools. The eastern section was led by the dwarves, and Brock ceremoniously drove the first support post of the branch line into Carn Dum, having settled his debt with the guild according to an old agreement. Severina was building a large bridge across the upper Olna, no longer at war with her father's river, but making peace with it. Gart became the head of all road construction in the kingdom, and learned to sign his full name, Gart of Lower Keys, because he had never had a last name, and now one was required for official documents. The road construction school in Marvin graduated its first 40 technicians, and Roland personally presented their diplomas. He appointed the son of the village headman from Vyazov as a foreman for the transit route. That same spring, an event occurred that Roland had been waiting for more than any of his victories. Varys brought a young apprentice to the office who, on his own initiative, had redesigned the command panel for the traction golem so that the golem would conserve 1/5 of its crystal heat on inclines. Roland looked at the panel's blueprint and realized he was seeing the first invention in this world, one made for the road, that wasn't his own. The world had stopped keeping pace with his memory. The world had begun to outpace it. That fall, during the first end-to-end transit inspection, the final conversation of this story took place, one that Roland would later recall more often than any other. King Edwin, aged but still lively, rode with him in the lead car across the entire country. And amid the clacking of the rail joints, he asked something he had never asked before. He asked how the young count had known all this from the very beginning, about the rails, the graphs, the dams, and the war of the clocks. They don't teach that anywhere in this world. Roland gazed out the window for a long time as the fields of Dolven, dotted with new stations, flew by. Then he replied that once, very far from here, there lived an engineer who had spent his entire life building roads and had died on one that remained unfinished. And that if the gods saw fit to grant such people a second chance, it would be a sin not to finish the road. The king thought for a moment and said that he wouldn't argue about the gods, but the second track on the Marvin capital line was needed by summer because there wasn't enough capacity. They both laughed and turned to business. Outside the window in the early twilight, the crystal lights of the passing loops along the entire stretch were coming on, just as the first stars appear in the sky. 12 years had passed. Express train. Number 1 was traveling from the Imperial border station of Eastern Gates to the port of Calder, carrying a new breed of machine golem, which the young technicians called the Runner, across the entire kingdom. The Runner covered 640 versts in 16 hours. In the passenger car, Count Roland Tarnwood, head of the Royal Road Commission, sat by the window and gazed at the country he had once first seen on a dusty map in a ruined estate. The country outside the window was different. Villages with tiled roofs and crystal lights stretched along the tracks. Nizhnaya Klayuchi, from where 20 starving men had once come to dig the first verst, had become a hub town with a depot, a school, and a market that drew people from as far as 30 versts away. Marvin had tripled in size, and its road engineering school, which had grown out of the original school, was graduating 200 technicians a year. The competition to get in was fiercer than at the capital's academy. 4,000 versts of track, 11 lines, and 2 major ports spanned the country.
The Empire transported silk, tea, and bronze through its transit routes. The West responded with grain, steel, and crystals, and transit duties provided the crown with 1/5 of the treasury. There had been no war for 12 years, and old Odo, now retired, grumbled that the army had forgotten how to walk because it rode everywhere. Roland was traveling to Calder not on college business. He was going to the opening of what he considered the final chapter of his own construction project. Today, in the Grand Hall of the Calder train station, the first graduating class of the Higher School of Railway Engineering was defending their thesis projects, and he had promised to serve on the committee. Severina was sitting across from him in the train car, correcting someone's bridge calculations with a red pencil, because she couldn't help but correct calculations, even while traveling. Over the years, she had built 19 large bridges, and her single-span arches now spanned 3 rivers. Their 2 children were sitting by the window. Their 12-year-old daughter, Alina, was reading a gnome textbook on mining, a gift from Grandpa Brock, as she called the old master. Her son, Oswald, 9 years old and named after the Baron's late grandfather, was pressed against the window, counting the oncoming trains. Lyra, along with her husband and the capital's chancellery, was waiting for them in Caldera. Hob had not lived to see this day. He had died in his sleep 3 years earlier, with the annual balance sheet compiled without a single error lying beside him. Varys hadn't sculpted anything himself in a long time,
But every new golem from the factory passed through his hands because the old man said that clay remembers the one who first molded it. Garth was riding on the same train in a service car, carrying a gift for the graduates from the railroad cooperatives. The first crutch from that very first verse, dug up during the relocation of the old line to heavy-duty rails. On the stretch past Marvane, Roland stepped out onto the open deck of the tail car and stood there alone for a long time. The train was passing through the Glenmore Valley. To the left, on the mountain, stood the ancestral estate where it all began, with the inventory of property and broken porcelain. To the right, the portal of the Sarngor Tunnel loomed darkly. The first tunnel in this world, now 13 years old, which the train sped through in 4 minutes. Roland recalled another world and another version of himself. The collapsed formwork, the darkness, and his final thought of the unfinished span. That engineer had died thinking it was all over. That engineer was wrong. In Caldera, they were greeted by the sea breeze, the horns of ships, and Dalton, now chairman of the port's Merchants' Assembly, who had never learned to welcome friends without a solemn speech. 36 graduates of the first higher education class sat in the station's grand hall. They were the children of railroad workers, fishermen, and farmers, 2 gnomes and 1 girl, the daughter of a switchman from the marsh line. The presentations went on all day. The projects were bold, and as Roland listened to them, he caught himself thinking that he wouldn't have come up with half of those solutions himself.
A bridge engineer proposed a suspension span across the strait on crystal cables. The locomotive engineer argued that a locomotive's speed could be doubled by splitting the heat into 2 stages. And last to present was a skinny guy from the north, who unveiled a project that silenced the entire room. A road through the northern ice to the whalers' winter camps.
A route across the permafrost that Roland had once struggled with, even in his previous life. And the young man proposed a solution that Roland hadn't considered. Not to fight the permafrost, but to preserve it. An embankment built on a stone foundation, ventilated throughout so that the ice beneath the track would never melt. Roland asked him the required questions, listened to the answers, and gave him the highest score. Then he asked the committee for the floor. He didn't speak at length. He told the graduates that 20 years ago in this country, the fastest thing was a horse, and the longest road was a pack trail. That the railroad tracks were laid by people who couldn't read but learned to. That a road isn't made of iron. Iron rusts. A road is an agreement among people that tomorrow will see further than we did yesterday. And that starting today, they're the ones upholding that agreement. That evening, all the locals gathered on the pier at Calder Port. They watched as the Imperial caravan was loaded under the crystal lights and as the fishing train approached from the north with its catch. Oswald asked his father if it was true that once upon a time, none of this existed at all. Roland replied that it had been even worse. All of this existed, but it never occurred to anyone that it was possible. His son thought for a moment and asked what, then, was the hardest part of building roads. Roland looked at his wife, at his children, and at the lights of the harbor where the track ended. A track that had once begun with a stake driven into the vacant lot behind Varys's workshop. The hardest part, he said, is that first stake. After that, the road builds itself. That night, Express Number 2 took them home to Glenmore. Severino was asleep on his shoulder. Outside the window, the lights of the signal boxes flashed by, and at each one, someone's well-trained son or daughter was on duty. Roland wasn't sleeping. He gazed into the darkness where the mountains were faintly visible and smiled. Somewhere out there in the north lay the permafrost, which was not to be conquered, but understood. Somewhere beyond the strait, the Empire was laying its first track based on blueprints purchased fairly. The world was rolling forward along steel rails and no longer needed the stranger's memory to keep moving. The engineer had received his second track and completed it to the end. The train was heading home through the night, and the path lay open before it. Malverna was brought to the capital on a winter morning aboard an Imperial courier ship under escort. Roland came to the pier himself, though he could have chosen not to. He wanted to see this man up close for the first and last time, without the throne rooms or the negotiating tents. The River Duke descended the gangplank in a simple traveling cloak without the colors of his house. He had grown gaunt and aged 10 years, and he held his back as straight as to those who have nothing left to lose but their bearing. Only the moneylender's eyes remained the same. Those eyes found Roland in the crowd at the pier instantly, and the Duke tilted his head ever so slightly. He did not bow. He acknowledged him. That is how one acknowledges a figure in the final line of a balance sheet. Along with him, the Empire handed over a chained chest containing the stolen blueprints, a campaign treasury of 30,000 Imperial ingots, Ulna's pilot's logs, and 2 engineers, whom the Duke had once bought out from the concession. Roland ordered that the engineers not be put on trial, but be returned to work under supervision. People sell themselves when they're underpaid and promise too much. It was the buyer's fault, not the goods. Hobb grumbled that the Count was being too generous, but he signed the payroll lists. The trial was scheduled for a month later, and for that entire month the capital talked of nothing else. The street leaflets that 3 years ago had portrayed Roland as a devil worshipper now depicted the Duke as a rat on a sinking barge. Roland read these leaflets with cold displeasure. The crowd that so easily changes its favorites might just change them back again tomorrow. He was summoned as a witness for the prosecution, and he walked into the courtroom, knowing that the verdict would depend on his words. Malvern maintained his usual demeanor of a kind uncle throughout the trial. He denied nothing. He explained. He spoke softly, and the chamber listened. He said that for 100 years his house had managed the kingdom's rivers, and that the rivers had faithfully provided for the crown. That every wharf, every backwater, every pilot on the Olne was his family, his order, and his responsibility to his ancestors. That then, a upstart from the backwoods had come along and, in 3 years, had shattered the way of life by which thousands of people had lived. The barge owners were losing their cargo. The pilots were drinking themselves into oblivion without work. The coastal towns were falling into poverty while the road builders grew rich. He asked the chamber if anyone had taken these people into account when calculating the concession fees. He said it wasn't just 3 counts who were rebelling. It was the old world that refused to die in silence, and that he had negotiated with the Empire over the very same thing the Crown ultimately agreed to on its own: transit. The Crown simply sold the Empire the road, while he sold the estuary. The difference was in the commodity, yet for some reason only he was accused of treason. An uneasy silence hung over the hall because there was a grain of truth in the traitor's words, and everyone could hear it. The peers stared at the floor. A few members of the old families nodded. Then Roland was given the floor. He stepped up to the railing and made no argument about the old world. He said the Duke was right. The barons were indeed losing their carriage business, and Roland cited a figure: 840 people over 3 years. Then he gave a second figure: 720 of them are now working on the road to the port of Calder and at the Crown's docks, and their average earnings have risen by a third. The lists, with names included, are on file in the college's office, and any peer may read them. Then he asked permission to cite other figures, and he did. How many people had died in the bridge explosions carried out by the Duke's River sappers? 17 railway workers and 3 guards. 14 of them left behind children. How many villages did the South burn as it marched on the capital under banners bought with his gold? 26. How many Imperial soldiers drowned on the shoals of the Tarda, where Pilot Malvern had led them, promising calm waters? 8,000 foreign lads who were deceived by the Fourth Throat and who had never done the kingdom any harm. Roland said he was willing to respect a man who defended his way of life. That way of life is defended in the council, in court, in the marketplace, and in fair haggling over prices. Malvern defended it with foreign mercenaries, a foreign empire, and foreign blood, and not once throughout the entire war with his own. He even abandoned the Count's army a day before the end. Even his fleet was surrendered not by him, but by his sailors. He bowed to the court and sat down. Malvern looked at him through the bars and, for the first time during the entire trial, remained silent. The sentence was read before a full courtroom. The death sentence by beheading was commuted, at his daughter's request, to life imprisonment in the northern fortress of Gloomy Stone. The House of the River Duke was abolished. His name was struck from the Book of Peers, and the fleet, docks, and harbors were transferred to the crown. Severina filed the petition herself on the very first day of the trial, and after the verdict, she personally took warm clothes, books, and a drafting kit to her father at the fortress. She returned a week later, silent, and worked for 3 days without looking up. Then she said only one thing to Roland. During the entire hour-long visit, her father never once asked about her, about the grandchildren he might never have, or about the house that was no longer there. He asked what the transit toll was stipulated in the transit agreement and whether it matched his old river toll. Upon hearing that the transit toll was lower, he smirked and said he'd always known he was being robbed. Severina said she had left the fortress a free woman, because there turned out to be no one left there to mourn. That same winter, they were married in the Glenmore Ancestral Temple. Roland had asked for a quiet wedding and got exactly what he deserved. The chapel was packed with Garth's travelers in their best shirts, Brocca's gnomes, who brought the newlyweds a wrought iron hearth by Master Varys, Dalton's merchants, and half the village of Nizhne Cluchi. The train carrying guests from the capital arrived on the old main line, decorated with fir branches from the steam locomotive's golem to the rear platform, and the engineer gave 3 long blasts of the whistle as it approached the estate. The king had sent a charter elevating the barony of Tarnwood to the rank of earldom, with a motto that Edwin had chosen himself. The path was clear. Hobb wept openly and told the guests from the capital that he had nursed the earl with these very hands, which was not true, but no one argued. Lyra caught the bride's bouquet, and a year later she herself stood in this cathedral with the young secretary of the royal chancellery. In the spring, construction began on what would later be called the work of a generation, the Great Transit, 640 versts from the eastern border gates through the Dwarven foothills, the capital, and Marvin to the port of Calder. The imperial gold arrived on time, down to the last ingot, and for the first time in both of his lives, Roland was building, not rushing to keep up with war and not fleeing ruin. He was building just as he had dreamed, with thorough surveys, double the required strength, and bridges built to last 100 years. Along the route, workers' camps were set up, complete with infirmaries, bathhouses, and schools for the children of the road workers. Hobb would complain about every school, only to later squeeze money out of the guild for them himself. The eastern section was led by the gnomes, and Brock ceremoniously drove a silver branch crutch into Carn Dum, settling his debt with the Brotherhood, according to an old agreement, made back when the first tunnel was built. Severina built a large bridge across the Upper Olna, no longer at war with her father's river but making peace with it, and she made the span of this bridge the most beautiful in the entire network. Garth became the head of all the kingdom's roadworks, and learned to sign his full name, Garth of Lower Keys, because he had never had a last name, and now it was required for official documents. The road construction school in Marvain graduated its first 40 technicians, and Roland personally presented the diplomas. He appointed the son of that very village headman from Vyazov, the one who had once confronted the surveyors with a pitchfork as a foreman on the transit route, and the old man came to witness his son's first paycheck while looking at the very road he had once cursed. That same spring, an event occurred that Roland had been waiting for more than any of his victories. Varys brought a young apprentice to the office, who on his own initiative had redesigned the command panel for the traction golem so that the golem would conserve 1/5 of its crystal heat on inclines. Roland looked at the blueprint of the stranger's panel and realized that he was seeing the first invention in this world created for the road, one not made by him nor within his lifetime. The world had stopped catching up to his past. The world had begun to outpace him. He rewarded the apprentice with a year's salary and hung the blueprint on the office wall. That fall, during the first end-to-end transit inspection, a conversation took place that Roland would later recall more often than any of his victories. King Edwin, aged but still lively, traveled with him in the lead car across the entire country, and amid the clacking of the rail joints, he asked a question he had never asked in all those years. He asked how the young count had known all this from the very beginning. About the rails, the dam's blueprints, and the war of the clocks?
Such things aren't taught anywhere in this world, and there's nothing about them in any book in the Royal Library. Roland gazed out the window for a long time as the fields of Dolven flew by, with their new stations and the lights of the passing loops.
Then he replied that once, very far from here, there lived an engineer who had spent his entire life building roads and died on one that remained unfinished. And that if the gods saw fit to grant such people a second chance, it would be a sin not to finish it. The king remained silent for an entire stretch of the journey. Then he said he wouldn't argue about the gods because the result of their work was traveling beneath him at the speed of a bird. But the second track on the Marvain capital line is needed by summer because capacity is once again insufficient, and that is no longer the gods' concern. They both laughed and talked business all the way to the capital. Outside the window in the early twilight, the crystalline lights of the passing loops lit up along the entire stretch, just as the first stars appear in the sky. 12 years had passed. Express train. Number 1 was traveling from the Imperial border station of Eastern Gate to the port of Calder, carrying a new breed of machine golem, which the young technicians called the Runner, across the entire kingdom. The Runner maintained its heat in 2 stages, according to the blueprints of that very same apprentice, Varus, and covered 640 versts in 16 hours with 12 stops. 20 years ago, this journey had taken a caravan 2 months. In the passenger car, Count Roland Tarnwood, head of the Royal Road Commission, sat by the window and gazed at the country he had first seen on a dusty map in a ransacked estate, along with an inventory of its property. The countryside outside the window was a different world. Villages with tiled roofs and crystal-clear lights stretched along the tracks, and at every railroad crossing stood a guardhouse with an attendant on duty. Nizhny Klyuchi, from where 20 starving men had once come to dig the first verst for a kopeck and a bowl of soup, had become a hub town with a depot for 40 golem, a school and a market to which people traveled from as far as 30 versts away. Vyaz built a stone church with profits from flax, and the cemetery, which had once nearly blocked the road, now lay behind a beautiful wrought iron fence paid for by the station's ticket office. Marvain had tripled in size. Its railway school, which had grown out of the original school, graduated 200 technicians a year, and the competition to get in was fiercer than at the capital's Academy of Sciences. Across the kingdom lay 4,000 versts of track, 11 lines, 2 seaports, and 380 stations. The empire transported silk, tea, bronze, and books via transit. The West supplied grain, fish, and crystals, and transit duties provided the crown with 1/5 of the treasury. There had been no war for 12 years. Old Odo, who had retired to an estate near Rakata, grumbled to his guests that the army had forgotten how to walk because it traveled everywhere by carriage. Yet he was always the first to arrive at every review, dressed in full-dress uniform. Kestrel had vanished somewhere in the south, never to be heard from again, and no one spoke of him. Malvern died in Gloomy Rock in his 8th year of imprisonment. Until his very last day, he sketched designs for river locks in his cell, which the commandant, following orders, sent to the capital. Roland read them and ordered 2 of them to be built without naming the author. Severina learned of this much later and remained silent for a long time, but then said that this was a fitting tribute. Roland was traveling to Calder today, not on college business. He was going to what he considered the final chapter of his own construction project. In the grand hall of the Calder train station, the first graduating class of the Higher School of Railway Engineering was defending their thesis projects, and he had promised to serve on the committee. Severnina sat across from him in the train car, correcting with a red pencil the bridge calculations someone had sent her for review, because she didn't know how to correct calculations, even while traveling. Over the years, she had built 19 large bridges, and her single-span arches now spanned 3 rivers. Newlyweds from the capital had taken to arranging rendezvous beneath the piers of her bridge across the upper Olna. 2 of their children were riding by the window. Their 12-year-old daughter, Alina, was reading a gnome textbook on mining, a gift from grandfather Brock, as she called the old master, and was making notes in the margins, which delighted Brock but horrified the gnome proofreaders of the textbook. Her son, Oswald, 9 years old and named after the Baron's late grandfather, was pressed against the window, counting the oncoming trains aloud but losing count after 20. Lyra, along with her husband and the entire capital's chancellery, was waiting for them in Caldera. Hob did not live to see that day. He died 3 years earlier. The old man had died in his sleep while reviewing the college's annual balance sheet, which he had compiled without a single error. And Roland ordered him to be buried with the honors befitting the kingdom's treasurer, while Hob's stylus now lay under glass in Glenmore's office. Varys hadn't sculpted anything himself in a long time, but every new golem from both factories passed through his hands because the old man used to say that clay remembers the one who first needed it. Dalton became chairman of the Calder Merchants Guild, amassed 3 warehouses, and never learned to greet friends without a solemn speech. Garth was riding on the same train in a service car, carrying the graduates a gift from the railroad cooperatives of the entire kingdom. The first spike from the first verst, dug up during the replacement of the old track with heavy rail, cleaned, and set into an oak plank. On the stretch past Marvain, Roland stepped out onto the open deck of the tail car and stood alone in the wind for a long time. The train was passing through Glenmore Valley. To the left, on the mountain, stood the ancestral estate where it all began, with the clatter of shattered porcelain and the inventory of the estate's possessions. To the right, the portal of the Sarngor Tunnel, the first tunnel in this world, loomed darkly. The tunnel was 13 years old, and the runner sped through it in 4 minutes. Roland recalled another world and another version of himself. The collapsed formwork, the darkness, and the last thought of the unfinished span that he had carried with him. That engineer had died thinking that it was all over and that his work had been left half-finished. That engineer was wrong twice. In Caldera, they were met by the sea breeze, the horns of the ships, Dalton with his speech, and Lyra, who speech Dalton's speech, which she habitually cut down to 1/3 of its length. In the station's grand hall, beneath the glass dome, sat 36 graduates of the first class of the higher school. Children of railroad workers, fishermen, and farmers. 2 young gnomes from Carn Duma, and 1 girl, the daughter of a switchman from the Marsh Line, who had ranked first in academic performance all 5 years. The defense presentations lasted all day. The projects were daring, and as Roland listened to them, he caught himself thinking that he himself would not have come up with half of the solutions, or would have spent years searching for them. The bridge engineer proposed a suspension span across a sea strait on crystal cables, and Severina filled 4 sheets with questions, but gave him the highest grade. The locomotive engineer argued that a locomotive's speed could be doubled by dividing the heat into 3 stages, and Varys, who had come to the defenses, listened to him with his mouth agape. The signalman's daughter defended a system of signal boards, whereby 2 trains on the same section of track could not meet even if the signalman made a mistake, and Roland recognized in her drawings what in his former world was called a block system, and how far this world had come on its own. Last to present was a thin young man from the north, who unveiled a project that silenced the entire hall. A route through the northern ice, to the whalers' winter camps, and the ore deposits of the Midnight Coast. A path through the permafrost, which had given Roland such a hard time in his past life in the north. And the young man proposed a solution that Roland hadn't considered. Not to fight the permafrost, but to preserve it. An embankment built on a rough stone foundation, with air flowing right through it so that the ice at the base would never melt and would itself hold the path as solid as a rock. Roland asked the required questions, listened to the answers, looked at the ventilation figures, and gave the highest score. Then he asked the committee for the floor. He stepped up to the board and spoke briefly. He told the graduates that 20 years ago, the fastest thing in this country was a horse, and the longest road was a pack trail over a mountain pass. That the first verse was dug by people who couldn't read, but learned to, and that the first bridge across the Great River was considered madness by the whole world until it stood over the Yonah. That a road is neither iron nor stone. Iron rusts. stone crumbles. A road is an agreement among people that tomorrow will see farther than yesterday, and that we can reach any person. And that starting today, this agreement is upheld by these 36 people, and after them, by those whom they themselves will train. Hart carried out the plank with the first crutch and handed it to the girl from the marshlands as the first to graduate, and the hall rose to its feet. That evening, all their people gathered on the pier at the Calder port. They watched as, beneath the crystal lights, the imperial caravan was being loaded, as a fishing train approached from the north with its catch, and as the lighthouse on the breakwater exchanged flashes with the Stormhold lighthouse. Oswald asked his father if it was true that once upon a time none of this had existed at all. Roland replied that it had been worse. All of this had always been possible, but it had never occurred to anyone that it was possible. His son thought for a moment and asked what, then, was the hardest part of building roads. Roland looked at his wife, at his children, at Garth and Varys by the railing, and at the harbor lights where the track, which had begun with a stake in a vacant lot, came to an end. The hardest part, he said, is that first stake. After that, the road builds itself. That night, Express number 2 took them home to Glenmore. The children were asleep. Severina was sleeping on his shoulder, and her slate had slipped from her fingers. Outside the window, the lights of the junctions flashed by, and at each light, someone's well-trained son or daughter was on duty. Roland wasn't sleeping. He gazed into the darkness where the mountains of Sarngor were faintly visible and smiled. Somewhere to the north lay the permafrost, which was not to be conquered but understood, and the skinny young man was already eager to embark on the exploration. Somewhere beyond the strait, the Empire was laying out its first railroad track based on honestly purchased blueprints and was calling for master craftsmen from Marvine, offering triple the usual salary. The world rolled forward along steel rails of its own accord and no longer needed the stranger's memory to keep moving. The engineer received his second track and completed it to the very end and beyond. The train traveled home through the night. The track lay open before it all the way,